The frost-bitten wind of Norvath 9 howled across the endless tundra like a living thing, dragging shards of ice and whispering secrets of death to anyone foolish enough to linger too long. The Galactic Academy's survival grounds stretched beyond the horizon, glittering under a pale sun that offered no warmth. Rows of cadets stood in silence, their multicolored uniforms marking the species of the galaxy's finest. They came from dozens of worlds, scaled, furred, feathered, or glistening with crystalline skin, each trained to endure extreme environments. Yet even among this diverse crowd, one stood out, the only human in the cohort, Lieutenant Ryan Cole. He stood with his back straight, his breath misting in the frigid air, eyes narrowed toward the wide expanse of frozen river that divided the field. The instructor, a towering insectoid creature with a chitin shell the color of rusted metal, raised his staff and spoke in a deep, echoing voice. "This," he said, gesturing toward the icy abyss, "is your final test, the river of Norvath. Beneath this ice flows a current strong enough to drag an armored cruiser under in seconds. Your task is to reach the opposite shore by sunset on the third day. No flight, no bridges, no thermal tools, only what the planet provides." His mandibles clicked sharply, sending a chill down the spine of every cadet. "Those who fail to cross will be retrieved when the storm settles, if the ice permits retrieval at all." The command ended any illusion of comfort. Around Ryan, cadets began whispering in their native tongues, assessing the terrain with whatever instincts evolution had given them. A hulking Carethian with scales of deep bronze stepped forward first, his heavy tail dragging furrows in the snow. He crouched low, pressing a clawed hand to the frozen surface. Steam rose from his skin as heat radiated outward, testing the thickness of the ice. "Solid," he hissed, smirking toward Ryan. "We cross by strength, human. You will freeze before the first step." Ryan said nothing. His lips were pale and chapped, but his eyes burned with quiet concentration. He had learned long ago that words wasted energy, and energy was life in places like this. Instead, he crouched near the river's edge and brushed a layer of frost away, revealing the glassy blue beneath. The ice was beautiful, dense, patterned with faint spirals formed by centuries of shifting current. It wasn't just frozen water, it was a living record of pressure, movement, and time. He ran his gloved hand across it, feeling its subtle vibrations. Beneath that silence, the river moved fast, unseen, but relentless. The other cadets began to spread out, each group attempting its own method. The Vorkai, slender avian beings with feathers shimmering in ultraviolet hues, spread their membranous arms and tested the wind, hoping to glide across sections of the frozen expanse. The reptilian Carethians and bulky Zarn used sheer force, slamming their claws and spears into the ice to carve out paths or platforms. Others, more aquatic species, tried to sense the water's pattern, timing their movements to avoid weak spots. The air soon filled with grunts, shouts, and the occasional scream as a cadet misjudged a step and vanished through the surface, swallowed by the river's roar. Ryan stayed still. He knelt, studying how the light reflected across the surface. The sun hung low, its cold rays bouncing off the frozen ripples, revealing lines, faults, fractures, seams of compressed frost. He traced them with his eyes, calculating where the current below was strongest and where the structure above was weakest. His gloved hand reached into the snow, pulling free a flat piece of mineral, thin, transparent, and hard as glass. He turned it in his palm, feeling its edges catch the light. It could serve as a blade, crude but sharp enough for what he had in mind. He heard laughter behind him. A pair of Vorkai cadets were watching, their elongated faces stretched in amusement. "Human still studying," one chirped in a high, musical tone. "He wants to read the ice like a book." The other joined in, voice lilting mockingly. "Maybe he hopes it will tell him where to step. Poor creature doesn't even have wings." Ryan ignored them. He pressed the mineral shard against the surface and pushed with steady pressure. A crack appeared, running in a clean, precise line. He adjusted his angle, carved again, and within minutes had outlined a rectangular block roughly the size of his torso. It was work that required patience, not strength. The wind grew harsher, slicing through his gear, biting into his exposed skin. His fingers ached, but he kept cutting, forcing his muscles to obey, remembering training drills on Antarctica back on Earth. The survival schools where cadets learned to build shelters from snow, to read wind direction by the movement of crystals, to find life where nothing should exist. This challenge was different only in scale. He pried the first block free and slid it aside, revealing a deep hollow of water below, dark and cold as night. The movement caught the attention of several nearby cadets, who paused to watch. "What are you doing?" one of the Zarn demanded, his voice vibrating like gravel. "You cut your own grave?" Ryan lifted the block slightly, tilted it on its side, and let it slide back toward the river. It floated, sluggishly but steadily, bobbing in place. "Testing buoyancy," Ryan muttered to himself, more to check the sound of his idea than to explain it. He pushed the block farther out and observed how it drifted with the current. It didn't sink. Instead, it rotated slowly and came to rest against another patch of ice. A seed of an idea formed in his mind, a way to cross without breaking the rules. He stepped back and surveyed the terrain. The river was wide, nearly 200 meters across. Too far to jump, too unstable to walk. The only way was to work with the ice, not against it. He began to cut more blocks, forming a line along the edge. Each one was thicker than the last, shaped with precision born from human stubbornness and ingenuity. Soon, a pattern began to emerge, something like stepping stones, though still separated by gaps of dark water. Hours passed. The sun arced lower, tinting the world in shades of silver and violet. Most of the other cadets had retreated to their camps, nursing injuries or conserving strength. A few had made it halfway across before being forced to turn back. Only Ryan remained near the river, surrounded by the fragments of his work. His breath came out in sharp bursts, freezing almost instantly. His muscles trembled with fatigue, but his eyes glimmered with purpose. The instructor watched from a distance, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the human's movements. He had seen hundreds of cadets over the years, creatures of logic, strength, instinct, but few with that strange mix of patience and madness. The insectoid teacher's antennae twitched in quiet curiosity. Humans were a young species, reckless and fragile, but they carried something dangerous: adaptability. When night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, the wind screaming like a chorus of ghosts. Ryan crouched beside his newly cut blocks, wrapping his arms around himself for warmth. He had built a small wall of ice shards to shield his position from the wind. As he stared at the frozen river stretching endlessly before him, he knew this was more than a test of skill. It was a test of identity. The galaxy often mocked humanity as weak, bound by biological limits, dependent on tools and technology. Yet here he stood, in a world that stripped him of all that, with only his hands and his will. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the creaking of the ice beneath him, the heartbeat of the planet itself. Somewhere in that sound, he found rhythm and understanding. The river wasn't an enemy. It was a living pattern waiting to be read. The next day, he would use that rhythm to move forward. For now, under the cold stars of Norvath, surrounded by alien cadets who doubted him, Ryan Cole sat in silence, sharpening his mineral blade against the ice. The faint light of twin moons caught his face, revealing not exhaustion, but determination. The divide was no longer an obstacle in his mind. It was a puzzle, and he intended to solve it. When the morning sun rose over Norvath 9, it brought no warmth, only a cruel shimmer that made the endless white glare almost unbearable. The wind had died down, leaving behind a brittle silence broken only by the faint creak of shifting ice beneath the river's surface. Ryan woke with his back against a jagged wall of ice he had built during the night, his body stiff and trembling from the cold. He flexed his hands inside frozen gloves, wincing as pain shot through his fingers. The air stung his lungs with every breath, but his mind was already moving, analyzing the frozen expanse before him. The first night had taught him something vital. The ice was alive in its own way. It moved, expanded, cracked, and sealed again in an endless cycle of quiet violence. If he wanted to survive this trial, he had to understand its rhythm, not fight it. Around him, the other cadets were beginning to stir. The Carethians were the first to rise, their reptilian bodies steaming faintly in the sunlight as their internal heat glands activated. They stomped toward the river's edge, testing the ice again with their claws. Further down the line, the Vorkai avians were spreading their wings to catch the morning updrafts, their feathers glinting like shards of obsidian. Their leader, a tall female named Arissa, gave Ryan a brief glance filled with skepticism before turning away. None of them spoke to him. They had seen what he did the previous day and dismissed it as human madness. But Ryan noticed that none of them had made any real progress across the river either. He rose, shaking the frost off his jacket, and walked to the edge of the river. The ice groaned softly under his boots, whispering warnings of depth and danger. He crouched down and inspected the nearest block he had cut the previous evening. Overnight, the temperature drop had fused parts of it to the river's surface, but it was still mobile enough to shift with a gentle push. The surface was smooth, almost glass-like, and the edges were clean. It was strong, dense, and slightly buoyant, exactly what he needed. The idea forming in his head had grown clearer overnight. He would build a floating bridge of ice blocks. It sounded insane, even to him, but insanity and ingenuity often shared the same bloodline. He selected a new spot a few meters downriver, where the ice was thicker and less fragmented. Kneeling, he pressed his gloved hand flat and felt the faint hum of water moving beneath. The current here was slower, the pressure more stable. Perfect. He picked up his mineral blade and began cutting again. The sound of cracking ice echoed sharply across the frozen plain. Each slice required focus and endurance. His breath fogged the air, forming small clouds that immediately froze and fell like powdered snow. Shards sprayed across his knees as he worked, his movements methodical, patient, and precise. Hours passed. He lost feeling in his fingers, but his rhythm remained steady. He cut rectangular shapes, each about a meter long and half as wide. When one was ready, he used a flat piece of broken ice as a lever to pry it free, then pushed it gently toward the water. The first block slid smoothly into the current, bobbing up and down but remaining intact. He gave it a shove with his boot, and it drifted outward, rocking slightly before settling against the others he had made the day before. One by one, he repeated the process until several floated in a line. They moved together like a chain of translucent stepping stones. A voice interrupted him. "You really think that will hold your weight?" It was one of the Zarn cadets, tall and broad-shouldered with skin resembling rough granite. The alien stood a few paces away, watching with crossed arms. His tone carried both curiosity and mockery. Ryan didn't answer. He wiped the frost from his visor and continued adjusting the angle of a block. "You'll drown before noon," the Zarn continued. "The river eats everything that touches it. No one crosses by ice." Ryan finally looked up and said evenly, "That's because no one bothers to shape it first." Then he turned back to his work, leaving the alien to mutter in disbelief as he walked off. The ice beneath the floating blocks groaned louder now as the current shifted, causing small cracks to spider out across the surface near Ryan's feet. He froze, crouching low to distribute his weight. The cracks widened, releasing faint whispers of trapped air. He could feel the vibration through his gloves. Slowly, he backed up and waited until the pressure equalized. The river was unpredictable, calm one moment, treacherous the next. But the experience taught him something new. The fractures always followed invisible lines that revealed the flow beneath. He began mapping those lines in his mind, marking which parts of the ice were stable and which were deceptive traps waiting to collapse. By midday, the alien cadets were growing restless. Several of them attempted to cross again, some by jumping from one natural ice platform to another, others by using ropes made of frozen fiber. Every attempt ended in failure. The ice cracked, or the current shifted, or exhaustion set in. One Vorkai lost his balance and plunged into the water, his wings thrashing desperately before freezing mid-motion. His partner screamed, but no one could help. The current dragged him beneath in seconds, leaving only a ripple. Ryan didn't look away. He had seen death before during survival training on Earth. Soldiers swallowed by glaciers, climbers lost to avalanches. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He took the event as confirmation of what he already knew. The only path forward was the one that adapted to the river's rhythm, not defied it. The sun hung low again, painting the ice in soft orange light. Ryan's hands were bleeding through torn gloves, the cuts on his fingers crusted with frost. Yet his mind was sharper than ever. He had managed to connect several blocks into a rough formation by wedging smaller pieces between them. The structure swayed with the water's motion but didn't break apart. It was primitive engineering, but it worked. He knelt at the edge and tested one block by stepping on it carefully. It dipped slightly under his weight but held steady. He shifted his balance, moved one foot forward, then the other. The block rocked but didn't flip. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself a thin smile. He turned back toward the camp and saw several cadets staring at him. Their expressions ranged from confusion to disbelief. No one had expected him to make it that far, least of all the instructor, who stood motionless on a ridge, observing with unblinking insect eyes. Ryan gave a small nod in acknowledgement, then crouched again to continue his work. The light was fading quickly, and the temperature was plummeting. He had only a few hours before the ice became too brittle to cut efficiently. As twilight fell, the air filled with faint cracking noises, tiny fractures echoing across the frozen landscape. The river was shifting again, tightening under the weight of its own currents. Ryan paused to listen, his body still as stone. The pattern was rhythmic, almost predictable now. Each crack came from a specific direction, corresponding to changes in pressure beneath the ice. He realized he could use this to his advantage. If he placed his blocks along the natural lines of stress, the river itself would help stabilize them. Nature could be an ally if one listened closely enough. He worked until the first stars appeared. His vision blurred from exhaustion, and his breath came in ragged bursts. Yet he refused to stop. The floating pathway stretched farther now, 10 meters, maybe more, reaching toward the river's heart like a thin, trembling thread. He tested another block, pressing his boot down until it dipped and held. Each success drove him forward, each small step a victory against the universe's indifference. When he finally stopped for the night, his body was trembling violently, his knees raw from kneeling on the ice. He sat beside his creation, staring out over the dark water. The moonlight danced across the surface, glimmering over the uneven line of floating blocks that marked his progress. He wasn't halfway yet, but the concept had been proven. The idea that had seemed foolish at dawn now stood as the only thing resembling a bridge across the deadly river. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath freeze and drift away like smoke. The alien campfires flickered in the distance, small pockets of heat amid the vast cold. Somewhere out there, the other cadets were likely discussing the human, mocking him perhaps, or quietly wondering how long he could last. Ryan didn't care. He leaned back against a mound of ice, letting the pain in his hands fade into numbness. The river groaned again, its surface shifting in subtle waves. It was alive, yes, but it was also learning him as much as he was learning it. He smiled faintly, eyes half closed, the reflection of the moons shimmering across his frost-covered face. "You and me, then," he whispered to the ice. "Let's see who gives first." The cold didn't answer, but deep beneath the surface, the current shifted just slightly, as if acknowledging the challenge. When dawn returned to Norvath 9, it painted the frozen wasteland in faint streaks of silver and violet. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, and the air felt sharp enough to slice through fabric. Ryan woke slowly, his breath shallow, his entire body stiff from the hours spent pressed against the ice. The faint light from the twin moons still lingered on the horizon, soon to be replaced by the pale sun that would rise but never warm. His muscles screamed in protest as he forced himself to move. Every joint, every tendon ached as if rusted, but he had no choice. He was running out of time. The trial would not wait. The river, shifting and alive, demanded constant attention. He crawled toward the edge where the floating blocks rested, now partially fused to each other by the night's frost. The line of ice extended out over the black water like a trail of ghosts. He ran his gloved hand along the edge of one block and pressed. It held. The layer of frost that had formed overnight gave the structure more stability than he had anticipated. The cold, for once, had done him a favor. He cracked a small smile, though his lips were split and bleeding. The plan was working, but the most difficult part was still ahead. He stood and looked across the river. The opposite shore was still distant, shimmering through a light haze of snow crystals suspended in the air. It looked impossibly far, but not unreachable. The alien cadets were already awake, their camps buzzing with low conversation and movement. Some had given up and were conserving strength for retrieval. Others, like the Vorkai leader Arissa, watched Ryan with silent fascination. Her wings were folded close to her body, and her violet eyes tracked his every move. She didn't speak, but her expression carried something new. Respect, perhaps, or the first flicker of understanding. Ryan began his work again, his blade moving through the ice with slow, deliberate precision. He had learned the river's rhythm now, the subtle sound of water shifting below, the tiny vibrations that warned him where the current was strongest. He used those cues to choose where to cut next. Each new block was measured by instinct, shaped to fit alongside the others. When one slid into place, he tested its buoyancy, then anchored it with smaller wedges chipped from the surrounding surface. The process was painfully slow, each motion costing energy he could not spare, but the results were undeniable. The structure grew, inch by inch, a fragile but functional pathway that floated where no bridge should exist. By midday, he had reached the point where the current grew more violent. The water beneath was no longer a slow, murmuring flow. It was a restless beast, shifting and pulling at the blocks with invisible claws. The ice trembled as he stepped forward to test the new section. The blocks swayed under his weight, creaking ominously. He crouched low to balance, pressing his gloved hands against the surface. The river's motion tugged at his legs, but he held steady. Each time the current shifted, the blocks adjusted and settled again, following the pattern he had designed. It was dangerous, but it worked. Behind him, voices rose from the shore. Several cadets had gathered to watch now. The Carethian who had mocked him earlier stood near Arissa, his scaled arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The instructor remained further back, his tall insectoid frame outlined against the horizon, unmoving but attentive. Ryan ignored them all. He had no time for observation or validation. His entire focus was on the ice, the angles, the pressure, the sound. Every decision was a calculation of survival. He reached for another block and began cutting it free. His blade, dulled from use, slipped once, scraping his glove and slicing through the outer layer of fabric. Blood welled at his knuckles before freezing into tiny crimson crystals. He didn't stop. Pain was irrelevant now, another part of the environment to adapt to. He freed the block, slid it into the water, and positioned it with careful movements. Each push required all his remaining strength. The current resisted him like a living creature, but he learned to use that resistance to his advantage, letting the flow carry the ice halfway into place before guiding it the rest of the way by hand. The floating structure began to stretch deeper into the river's heart, rocking gently but holding firm. At one point, the ice beneath his knees trembled violently. He froze, listening. A deep, hollow crack thundered from somewhere downstream, followed by the slow ripple of shifting pressure. The river was changing again. He could feel it under him, the flow growing faster, the tension rising as the frozen crust began to fracture. If he stayed too long in one spot, the entire section could collapse. He moved quickly, stepping from one block to another, testing each before transferring his weight. Every movement was deliberate, practiced. The bridge swayed dangerously, but he kept his balance, driven by the primal rhythm of survival that pulsed through his veins. When he reached the midpoint of the river, he paused. The air here was colder, thinner, carrying the metallic taste of frozen minerals. The wind was stronger, too, rushing across the open water and cutting into his exposed skin like 1,000 blades. He knelt, pressing his hand against the nearest block. Frost crystals sparkled in the weak sunlight, glowing faintly blue. He adjusted one wedge and hammered it in place with a smaller chunk of ice. The sound echoed across the river, hollow and distant. From the opposite shore, the instructor watched with subtle fascination as the human's creation defied all logic. By late afternoon, Ryan had nearly doubled the length of his floating path. His movements were slower now, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his mind remained sharp. Each block was placed with a craftsman's precision, its shape calculated to match the water's rhythm. He was no longer fighting the current. He was cooperating with it. The river, once an adversary, had become his unwitting ally. The ice flexed and shifted in harmony with the flow, each block adjusting slightly as the water passed beneath. It wasn't stability born of rigidity, it was balance born of motion. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the light turned golden and diffused through the mist of snow, casting a surreal glow over the scene. Ryan stood on the farthest block, staring at the remaining stretch of river before him. His reflection wavered on the dark surface, distorted by ripples. He could almost see his destination now, the faint line of the opposite shore calling to him through the cold. Behind him, the cadets murmured among themselves, their skepticism eroding into quiet awe. For all their biological advantages, none had thought to use the planet itself as part of the solution. The human had done it through observation, patience, and an understanding born of struggle. The river shifted again. A deep rumble rolled beneath his feet, followed by the sound of ice plates grinding against each other. He turned sharply, scanning for weak points. A few of the earlier blocks began to drift apart, their wedges dislodged by the increased pressure. He cursed under his breath and hurried back, moving carefully along the trembling path. His boots splashed icy water as he knelt to realign the pieces, pushing them back into place. The cold bit deep into his flesh, but he worked with calm precision, locking the sections again using slivers of compacted snow and fragments of ice. When the motion steadied, he allowed himself a slow exhale. The sun disappeared completely, leaving only the pale twilight glow of the twin moons. Ryan remained on the ice bridge, crouched low, watching how the current changed in darkness. The water reflected faint lunar light, its surface alive with motion. He studied it like a living map, marking in his mind how the flow tugged at certain points more than others. His floating pathway had become an extension of his will, fragile, imperfect, but functional. The night wind picked up again, scattering fine snow across his shoulders. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the river fill him, the steady rhythm of movement and pressure reminding him of his own heartbeat. Hours passed before he returned to the shore, his limbs nearly frozen stiff. When his boots finally touched solid ground, a quiet cheer rose among a few cadets who had been watching in silence. Even the reptilian Carethian gave a small nod of respect, though his expression quickly returned to its usual grimness. The instructor remained motionless, but spoke at last, his voice a low rumble that carried across the plain. "Human," he said, "you redefine the rules of adaptation." Ryan didn't answer. He simply looked back at the frozen river, where his narrow floating path shimmered under the moonlight like a scar across the planet's face. It was far from complete, and he knew that the hardest part, crossing fully to the other side, still awaited him. But for now, standing in the cold silence of Norvath 9, surrounded by creatures who had doubted him, he felt something he hadn't felt in days, the quiet certainty that he was going to make it. By the time the next dawn arrived, the frozen light over Norvath 9 revealed a world reshaped by the night's storms. Jagged lines of frost carved new patterns across the river, and the air shimmered with a dangerous stillness that warned of change. Ryan awoke to the sound of ice cracking in the distance, a deep, bone-shaking sound that rolled through the frozen plain like thunder. He rose quickly, muscles heavy from exhaustion, and scanned the horizon. The bridge he had built glimmered faintly under the morning light, still standing but visibly strained. The sections closer to the far shore shifted slightly with the current, swaying under invisible pressure. He knew what that meant. The river was beginning to wake. He ate a handful of frozen rations, forcing himself to chew, though his mouth felt numb. The alien cadets watched from a distance now, no longer mocking, only silent. The instructor's dark figure stood against the horizon, motionless, observing everything. The test wasn't over, but the atmosphere had changed. Every movement on the river now felt like an echo of what would come next. Ryan tightened his gloves and walked toward the edge, his boots crunching through thin layers of frost. His reflection appeared briefly on the ice before vanishing beneath a sudden ripple. The current was rising faster than he expected. He stepped onto the first block. It held. The second shifted under his weight, creaking but steady. The sound was no longer the clean, sharp tone of frozen stillness. It was deeper, resonant, a warning of what lay beneath. The entire river vibrated faintly, as if the water itself was alive and restless. Ryan ignored the fear tightening his chest and continued forward, one block at a time. The floating path swayed and dipped with each step, but his movements were precise, balanced by the rhythm he had learned over the past days. The cold wind whipped across his face, biting into the exposed skin on his cheeks, but his focus never wavered. Halfway across, the first tremor struck. It came without warning, a sudden jolt that knocked him to one knee. The block beneath him tilted dangerously, water sloshing up the sides as the current surged beneath. He clung to the edge, his gloved fingers gripping the ice so tightly that his knuckles went white. Another tremor followed, louder, deeper. A crack shot across one of the earlier blocks, splitting it in half. The sound was deafening, echoing across the valley. The cadets on the shore shouted something, but the wind swallowed their voices. Ryan looked back, watching as the section behind him began to crumble. Pieces of ice slipped into the black water, vanishing instantly. He turned forward again, knowing there was no way back now. The river had chosen its moment. He needed to move or die where he stood. Adrenaline surged through his veins, warming his body as instinct took control. He ran, not recklessly, but with the precision of a soldier trained to survive chaos. Each step landed on a block that dipped and rocked violently under his weight. He adjusted constantly, bending low, arms out for balance. The river roared beneath him, white foam bursting through cracks where the current forced its way up through the gaps in the ice. A section ahead began to drift apart, the wedges that held it together breaking loose. He lunged forward, landing on the shifting surface just as one block spun away, colliding with another and breaking into shards. Cold water splashed across his legs, freezing instantly into a thin layer of frost. He felt the sting but pushed through it. The gap ahead widened rapidly, and he realized he would have to jump or lose the chance entirely. He crouched, every muscle tense, and leapt across the open stretch. The world blurred for a heartbeat, ice, air, water, and then his boots slammed into the next block. It rocked violently but didn't break. He caught his balance, breathing hard, the sound of his heartbeat loud in his ears. The storm above intensified. Snow began to fall in thick sheets, blurring his vision and coating the surface around him. The wind screamed across the frozen expanse, dragging sharp crystals of ice into his face. He could barely see the next block ahead, only the faint outline of pale light reflecting off the surface. He moved slower now, hands guiding him as much as his eyes. The sound of the river beneath grew more violent, less like water, more like something alive and furious. The current slammed into the blocks, breaking several loose. He could feel the path unraveling behind him, one section at a time. Then came the worst moment. A deep, thunderous crack split the air, louder than anything before. The block he was standing on tilted sharply forward, sending him sliding toward the water. He threw himself sideways, managing to grab the edge of another floating slab, his body half submerged in the freezing current. The cold hit him like an explosion, stealing his breath instantly. His hands went numb within seconds, but he forced his grip tighter, pulling himself up inch by inch. Every movement sent shards of pain through his arms, but he refused to let go. The weight of soaked gear dragged him down, the ice beneath his gloves slick and unforgiving. He pressed his forearm against the edge for leverage, then heaved with all his strength. For a brief, terrifying moment, the block beneath him dipped completely underwater, and he thought it was over. But the current shifted again, lifting it just enough for him to scramble back onto the surface. He collapsed on his knees, gasping for breath. His entire body shook uncontrollably, the cold spreading like fire through his veins. The water in his boots had already turned to ice. He glanced up at the shore, so close now he could make out the faint outline of rocks and frost-covered ground. Just a few more meters. Behind him, his bridge disintegrated. Each block cracked and sank in slow, haunting rhythm, disappearing into the black depths one after another. The sound was like glass shattering underwater. He pushed himself upright and staggered forward. The last section of the floating path tilted sharply under his weight, one edge dipping beneath the surface. He could feel the suction of the current pulling at his boots, trying to drag him in. He forced himself to move faster, every step more unstable than the last. His vision blurred from exhaustion and cold, but he could see the end now, a small ledge of rock jutting from the frozen bank. He reached the final block just as the ice behind him gave way completely. The river erupted in chaos, sending waves of freezing water slamming against his legs. He didn't think, he simply acted. He pushed off with everything he had left, launching himself toward the shore. The leap felt endless. The world seemed to slow around him, every heartbeat stretching into eternity. Then his chest hit the ice-covered ground, knocking the air from his lungs. His hands clawed forward, finding a hold on a jagged edge of rock. The river roared behind him, swallowing the last remnants of his bridge. For a long time, he didn't move. He lay there, half on land, half on the shattered edge of the river, breathing in shallow gasps. Every muscle in his body burned, but he felt alive. He had done it. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the colorless sky. Snowflakes drifted down, landing softly on his face and melting against the heat of his skin. The storm had quieted as suddenly as it began, leaving only the sound of the river churning below. The air was still again, almost peaceful. When he finally sat up, he could see the far shore across the river, where the alien cadets stood in stunned silence. Orissa was among them, wings folded close, her expression unreadable. The instructor stood beside her, arms crossed, his antennae twitching slowly. The others didn't move, as if unsure whether to cheer or mourn. Ryan raised a trembling hand in acknowledgement, though his arm barely obeyed him. He wasn't celebrating. He was too cold, too drained, too aware of how close he had come to dying. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the fatigue and pain, a small fire burned, a stubborn human pride that refused to die out. He crawled away from the edge, each motion slow and deliberate. His gear was soaked, his body numb, but his mind remained sharp. He found a small rise of snow-covered ground and collapsed there, leaning against the rock for support. The view from this side was different. The river looked smaller, less monstrous, almost calm. The floating blocks that had carried him across were gone, but the memory of their rhythm remained imprinted in his mind. He had crossed not by force or luck, but by understanding. As the last of the light faded from the sky, He allowed himself a brief moment of stillness. The cold no longer frightened him. He had seen what it could do, felt it bite into his flesh, and survived it. Somewhere behind him, the instructor activated his communicator, signaling the others that the human had completed the trial. The sound echoed faintly across the frozen expanse, but Ryan didn't react. He closed his eyes, the faintest hint of a smile on his cracked lips, and whispered into the cold air, "Not bad. For no bridge." The river continued to flow beneath him, indifferent and eternal, but that night, under the light of Norvath's twin moons, the ice seemed to hum with quiet respect for the human who had defied it. The wind on the far bank of the Norvath River was quieter than before, as though the storm itself had paused to observe what had been achieved. The dawn was thin and colorless, spreading through a haze of snow like light through glass. Ryan remained where he had collapsed, resting against a rock formation that jutted out from the frozen ground. His body was stiff, his hands raw and bleeding, but his mind refused to let go of alertness. The sound of the river behind him was now softer, almost subdued. The chaos of the previous day had calmed into the slow murmur of surrender. He had crossed, but the memory of the struggle still lived inside his bones. For several minutes, he simply sat there, eyes fixed on the dark water that had nearly claimed him. The ice at the edges still creaked and shifted, small fractures forming and closing again in a slow rhythm. The faint sunlight caught the frozen spray that clung to his jacket, turning it into a coat of pale crystals. He looked down at his hands, their skin torn open where the gloves had failed. The blood had frozen into thin red lines, merging with the frost. He flexed his fingers once, testing the pain, then exhaled a shaky breath that misted in the air. It was over, or so it seemed. Movement on the opposite bank caught his attention. The alien cadets had gathered at the water's edge, their faces lit by the glow of the early sun. They were silent, watching him. Arissa, the avian cadet who had once mocked him, stepped forward, her wings folded tightly against her body. The Carethian stood beside her, his scaled head lowered slightly in acknowledgement. No one spoke for a long time. The river between them was a reminder of what separated their species, yet the path Ryan had created, though now destroyed, had bridged something larger than distance. He forced himself to stand, every movement deliberate and painful. His legs trembled from the cold, but he faced the others without flinching. He raised his arm weakly and gestured toward the remains of the river, then shouted across the water, his voice hoarse but steady. "You can still cross!" The sound carried in fragments, torn apart by the wind. At first, the aliens didn't understand. Then, as he motioned with his hands, demonstrating the rhythm of the blocks that once floated there, realization began to dawn on them. Arissa stepped closer to the edge, studying the river's surface. The current was still strong but no longer violent. The remaining fragments of ice, some of which had reattached to each other overnight, floated in slow, lazy circles. She turned to the others and said something sharp and decisive. A few of them began cutting at the ice along their side of the river, mimicking what Ryan had done days before. They worked cautiously, their movements uncertain at first. The Carethian used his claws to cut larger pieces, while the smaller cadets pushed them toward the water. Ryan watched, his breath shallow, as the aliens began piecing together a line of blocks that followed the same rhythm he had once read in the current. He didn't interfere. He didn't shout instructions. He simply observed, knowing that understanding could not be taught through words alone. It had to be felt. The vibration of the ice beneath one's hands, the resistance of the water against one's weight, the patience required to balance what could not be forced. When one of the blocks drifted too far, Arissa adjusted it, using the wind under her half-spread wings to guide it back into place. The moment the block steadied, she looked up, meeting Ryan's gaze across the river. He nodded once, and she nodded back. Hour by hour, the structure began to take shape. The aliens worked together in silence, each movement more confident than the last. They learned to wedge smaller fragments between the larger ones, to let the current assist instead of fight it. What had seemed madness only days ago now unfolded as logic in motion. Ryan could almost see the realization forming behind their eyes, an understanding of why the human had done what he did. It wasn't about strength or speed or superiority. It was about cooperation, with the environment, with others, even with one's own limitations. When the bridge finally reached the midpoint of the river, the instructor stirred for the first time that morning. He moved closer, his insectoid form towering above the cadets. His antennae flicked once, and his voice, though calm, carried the weight of judgment. "Continue," he said simply. His words were not a command, but an acknowledgement that the trial was still in progress. The cadets pressed on, guided by a rhythm that no longer belonged to instinct alone, but to shared purpose. Ryan stepped back from the edge as they reached his side. The first to arrive was Arissa. She landed lightly on the frozen ground, her eyes filled with exhaustion and something deeper: respect. She looked at him closely, as if trying to understand what kind of creature could look at an impossible task and see not a wall, but a pattern waiting to be shaped. Behind her, the Carethian approached, his heavy steps cracking the frost underfoot. He grunted, a low, resonant sound that might have been laughter or approval. "You made the river obey," he said, his voice rough. Ryan shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "I listened to it." The others gathered behind them, forming a semicircle around him. For the first time since the challenge began, there was no hostility, no suspicion, only quiet acknowledgement. The instructor arrived last, his metallic legs clicking softly as he approached. He studied Ryan for a long moment, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the faint light of the snow. "The objective," he began, "was survival. You were expected to reach the far side. You did so, though the method was unorthodox." He paused, turning slightly toward the river where the floating path now lay still. "But what followed, this cooperation, was not required. You gave them knowledge that cost you strength. Why?" Ryan met his gaze without hesitation. His voice was steady, though his body trembled from fatigue. "Because survival isn't just about reaching the end alone," he said. "It's about making sure someone else can cross after you." The instructor tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered his staff and said, "The river tested more than endurance today. It tested the nature of will." The trial officially ended with that declaration. A signal flare shot into the air, scattering golden sparks across the pale sky. The cadets began returning to their camps, but none spoke for several minutes. The silence was not of distance, but of reflection. As the others moved away, Arissa remained near the river's edge, looking at the faint outline of the path that still floated between the banks. "Your kind sees patterns where others see danger," she said softly. "Maybe that is why you endure." Ryan didn't answer immediately. He watched the water move, still unpredictable but no longer hostile. "Maybe," he finally said. "Or maybe we just hate losing." When the evacuation shuttles arrived later that day, the frozen landscape of Norvath 9 already looked different. The shattered fragments of ice had refrozen into strange shapes, bridges, arches, and clusters that resembled a chain across the river. From above, it looked almost deliberate, as if the planet itself had preserved the humans' defiance as a monument. As the cadets boarded the transport, the instructor made one final note in his report. His voice was measured, each word deliberate. Observation: human adaptability manifests through comprehension of natural rhythm and collective purpose. When confronted with limitations, he does not resist the environment. He learns its language. Ryan stood near the shuttle's window as the engines ignited, watching the frozen river recede into the distance. The reflection of his face merged with the image of the ice below, a reminder of what he had built and what it had taught him. He realized then that the real victory was not the crossing itself, but what followed. the moment when the others learned to trust his method, to find balance between chaos and order. That was the lesson humanity carried to the stars, not dominance, but understanding. As the shuttle broke through the cloud layer and the pale surface of Norvath 9 faded beneath him, Ryan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. His body still ached, and the cuts on his hands throbbed with dull pain, but a deep calm settled over him. Somewhere in that silence, he felt the rhythm of the river again, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. It had tested his limits, demanded his strength, and in return, it had shown him the quiet truth of survival. The report that later reached the Academy archives would mark the Frozen River Challenge as one of the most innovative solutions in the program's history. But for Ryan, it wasn't about recognition. It was about what the river had whispered when he stood on its edge for the last time. That even in the coldest, most unforgiving corners of the galaxy, there was always a way forward if one listened closely enough. And as the stars unfolded around the shuttle like distant embers, he smiled faintly to himself, knowing that on some level, Norvath had listened back.